I guess I should start by saying I never thought my marriage would end up like this. Emily and I weren't perfect, but who is? We met at a mutual friend's party about 6 years ago. She had this energy about her. Light, easy, magnetic. I was the quieter type, but she pulled me into her world without effort. We clicked almost immediately, and within a year, we'd moved in together. Marriage followed soon after, and for a while, it felt like everything was falling into place. The cracks didn't show up right away. At least, not in a way I could clearly see. Looking back now, I can pick out moments that should have made me stop and question things. Like how she always needed to be the center of attention at every gathering. Or how she had this way of twisting arguments so I'd end up apologizing, even if I wasn't the one who'd done anything wrong. But at the time, I chalked it up to personality quirks. Nobody's perfect, right? Things started changing after we hit our third anniversary. It wasn't sudden, more like a slow shift I didn't notice until it was impossible to ignore. Emily started pulling away in little ways. She'd be glued to her phone at night, claiming it was work-related, even though her job had never been that demanding before. She started staying out later with friends, brushing off my questions with, "You wouldn't know them. They're from the office." It wasn't just the behavior. It was the tone. Dismissive, like I was being unreasonable for even asking. At first, I tried to rationalize it. She was busy, stressed, maybe even bored after years of routine. I told myself it was just a rough patch and that I needed to give her space. But that didn't stop the sinking feeling in my gut every time she came home late, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers. Or when she'd laugh at something on her phone and quickly swipe away the screen if I happened to look over. I started second-guessing myself. Was I being paranoid? Insecure? Was I making her feel smothered? Those thoughts crept in late at night when she was asleep beside me, her phone face down on the nightstand, just out of reach. I'd stare at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how to face it yet. The breaking point came on a Friday evening. Emily had told me earlier in the week that she'd be out with some coworkers for drinks. That wasn't unusual. She'd been going out more and more lately. But something about the way she said it felt off. Her voice was too casual, like she was trying to make it sound normal. Still, I didn't say anything. I didn't want to start another fight over what could have been nothing. That night, I stayed home and tried to distract myself with a movie, but I couldn't focus. Every time I checked my phone, I felt this itch to text her, to ask if she was okay, but I stopped myself. Around 10 p.m., I finally gave in and decided to go to bed. As I walked past the living room window, I noticed her car parked across the street. At first, I thought she'd come home early, but the car was empty. She wasn't inside. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. Her car wasn't parked in its usual spot. It was further down, near the end of the block, like she didn't want me to notice it. My pulse quickened, and for a moment, I stood there, trying to decide what to do. Then I saw her. She was walking toward the car, laughing, with a man I didn't recognize. They stopped near the driver's side, and he leaned in close. Too close. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. The way she looked at him, relaxed, playful, was enough. My stomach twisted as I watched her reach out and touch his arm, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, watching as she got into the car. The man stood on the sidewalk, waving her off as she drove away. She didn't see me when she passed. Or if she did, she didn't care. When I got back inside, I sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen. I felt numb, like my brain couldn't process what I'd just seen. A part of me wanted to call her, to demand an explanation, but I already knew the answer. I just wasn't ready to hear it out loud yet. She came home a little after midnight, acting like everything was fine. She kissed me on the cheek, said, "You're still up," like nothing had happened. I mumbled something about not being able to sleep and watched as she went upstairs to shower. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like I didn't know the person I was sharing a bed with. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Emily moving around in the kitchen. She was humming softly, making coffee, and pretending like nothing was wrong. I stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling and replaying the scene from the night before in my head. I wanted to believe there was some logical explanation, something that would make it all make sense. But every time I tried to convince myself, the image of her laughing with that guy flashed through my mind, and my stomach twisted all over again. Eventually, I got up and headed downstairs. She greeted me with a bright smile, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter. "Morning. I made your favorite." Her tone was cheerful, but it felt forced, like she was overcompensating. "Thanks," I muttered, taking the cup. I wasn't ready to bring up what I'd seen. Not yet. I needed to figure out how to approach it without giving her the chance to deflect or gaslight me into thinking I'd imagined it. She leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone, and I noticed how casual she seemed. Like nothing had changed, like she didn't have a care in the world. It made me feel sick. I finished my coffee quickly and told her I had errands to run. She barely looked up, just gave me a distracted, "Have fun," as I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. I didn't actually have anywhere to go, so I ended up driving aimlessly for a while, my thoughts racing. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to get it over with, but another part of me was terrified of what she'd say. What if she lied? What if she admitted it? Either way, there was no going back once I opened that door. Eventually, I parked in an empty lot and sat there, staring at my phone. I thought about calling Mark, but I knew what he'd say. He'd tell me to stop wasting time and confront her, to demand the truth. But it wasn't that simple. This wasn't just some argument we could resolve. This was our marriage. 5 years of my life. If I was going to face her, I needed to be sure. That night, I decided to watch her more closely. She had mentioned earlier that she might go out again with the girls, which made me instantly suspicious. She'd been going out more frequently over the past few months, but now I couldn't help but wonder how many of those nights had actually been spent with this mystery guy. Around 6 p.m., she started getting ready, putting on more makeup than usual, fixing her hair in a way she only did for special occasions. I sat in the living room, pretending to scroll through my phone, but I was watching her out of the corner of my eye. She glanced at me a few times, almost like she was testing the waters, but I didn't say anything. When she finally came downstairs, she grabbed her purse and gave me a quick kiss on the cheek. "Don't wait up," she said with a smile. And just like that, she was gone. This time, I didn't hesitate. As soon as I heard the car pull away, I grabbed my jacket and followed her. I stayed a few cars behind, careful not to get too close. My heart was pounding the entire time, but I couldn't stop now. I needed to know. She drove across town to a small restaurant I didn't recognize. When she parked and went inside, I stayed in my car, watching from a distance. A few minutes later, the same man from the night before showed up. He walked in like he'd done this 100 times before, like it was routine. I felt a wave of anger rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed more than this. Seeing them together wasn't enough. I needed proof, something undeniable. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few pictures from the car. They weren't great, but they showed enough. For the next hour, I sat there, watching as they ate and laughed, completely oblivious to the fact that I was right outside. It was surreal, like I was watching someone else's life instead of my own. When they finally left, they walked to her car together, and I saw him lean in and kiss her. That was it. I didn't need to see anything else. I drove home in a daze, my mind spinning. By the time she got back, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the pictures pulled up on my phone. She walked in, smiling, until she saw the look on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice cautious. I held up the phone, the screen facing her. "Who is he, Emily?" I asked, my voice cold and steady. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she just stared at the screen. Then she opened her mouth, probably to deny it, but I cut her off. "Don't lie to me," I said. "I followed you. I saw everything." The color drained from her face, and she looked down, unable to meet my eyes. I can explain," she stammered. "Explain what?" I snapped. "That you've been sneaking around behind my back? That you've been lying to me for months? What part of this am I supposed to understand, Emily?" She didn't answer. Instead, she sank into the chair across from me, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered. It got out of hand. Out of hand. I repeated, my voice rising. You cheated on me, Emily. This isn't some mistake you can just brush off. This is our marriage. She started crying, but it didn't faze me. I was too angry, too hurt to care. For the first time, I saw her for who she really was, someone who had taken everything we built and thrown it away. I don't want to hear your excuses, I said, standing up. I just want the truth. How long has this been going on? She hesitated, wiping her tears. A few months, she admitted quietly. It didn't mean anything, I swear. I was lonely. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Lonely? I repeated, incredulous. I've been here the whole time, Emily. You didn't talk to me. You didn't tell me you were unhappy. You just went and found someone else. I didn't know how to talk to you, she said, her voice breaking. You're always so distant. I laughed bitterly. Distant? You think I'm distant? You've been sneaking around, lying to my face, and you have the nerve to say I'm the problem? She didn't say anything, just sat there crying as I grabbed my keys and walked out. I needed air, space, anything to get away from her. As I drove aimlessly through the city, one thought kept running through my mind. This wasn't the woman I married, and maybe she never was. I didn't go back home that night. Instead, I ended up at Mark's place, sitting on his couch with a beer in my hand, trying to make sense of everything. He didn't ask many questions. He could tell by the look on my face that I wasn't ready to talk. After a while, though, the silence became too much, and the words just started pouring out. I told him everything, about following Emily, about the guy, about how she had the audacity to say she was lonely when I'd been right there all along. Mark listened, nodding occasionally, his jaw tightening the further I got into the story. When I was done, he leaned back and let out a long breath. Man, I don't even know what to say, he admitted. That's brutal. But you can't keep doing this to yourself. You deserve better. I wanted to believe him, but it wasn't that simple. The betrayal had hit me like a truck, and even though I knew Emily's actions were on her, I couldn't stop questioning myself. Was I really distant? Had I missed something? Some sign that things were falling apart? Or was she just making excuses to justify what she'd done? The next morning, I went back to the house. I didn't want to, but I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. When I walked through the door, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Usually, she'd be up by now, making coffee or scrolling through her phone at the dining table. But the house felt empty, like she'd already moved out in her head. I found her in the living room, sitting on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes were puffy, and she looked like she hadn't slept all night. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she broke the silence. I know I'm the last person you want to talk to, she said softly, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I stayed standing, my arms crossed. Sorry for what, exactly? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. For cheating? For lying? Or for getting caught? She flinched at that last part, but I didn't feel bad. She had earned every ounce of my anger. All of it, she said after a moment. I know I screwed up. I know I hurt you. And I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything, but I need you to hear it. I shook my head. What am I supposed to do with that, Emily? You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed everything we built together. Do you even understand what you've done? Her eyes filled with tears again, but I didn't let it sway me. This wasn't about her feelings. This was about the damage she'd done, the trust she'd shattered. I didn't want it to end up like this, she said. I didn't mean for it to go this far. You didn't mean for it to go this far? I repeated, my voice rising. You knew exactly what you were doing every time you went to see him. You chose this, Emily. Don't act like it just happened by accident. She didn't argue, didn't try to defend herself. She just sat there, staring at the floor like she couldn't even look at me. For a second, I thought about walking out again, but something kept me there. Maybe it was a need for closure. Maybe I just wasn't ready to leave things unfinished. So what now? I asked finally. What do you expect me to do? Pretend like this never happened? Try to move past it? I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't want to lose you. It felt like a punch to the gut, hearing her say that after everything. But at the same time, it felt hollow. If she didn't want to lose me, she wouldn't have done what she did. It was as simple as that. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. And even if I could, I don't think I'll ever trust you again. And without trust, what's left? She didn't have an answer for that, and honestly, neither did I. For a few minutes, we sat there in silence, the weight of everything hanging heavy in the air. Eventually, I stood up and grabbed my jacket. I need some time to think, I said. I don't know what happens next, but I can't figure it out with you hovering over me. She nodded, not trying to argue, and I walked out the door. This time, it didn't feel like running away. It felt like I was finally taking a step towards something, though I had no idea what that something was. Over the next few days, I stayed at Mark's place again, trying to sort through my thoughts. Emily sent a couple of texts, but I didn't respond. I needed space, and I wasn't ready to deal with her yet. Instead, I spent most of my time replaying everything in my head, trying to make sense of how we'd gotten here. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about the cheating. This was about all the little cracks that had been forming for years, the ones I'd ignored because I didn't want to see them. One night, Mark and I were sitting on his balcony, sharing a six-pack, when he finally spoke up. You know you don't owe her anything, right? He said. You don't have to stay just because it's familiar, or because it's what you're used to. Sometimes, letting go is the only way to move forward. I didn't say anything, but his words stuck with me. Deep down, I knew he was right. I'd spent so much time trying to hold on to the idea of what Emily and I used to be that I hadn't stopped to think about what we'd actually become. And the truth was, we weren't the same people anymore. Maybe we never had been. The next morning, I called Emily. When she picked up, I could hear the tension in her voice, like she was bracing herself for whatever I was about to say. We need to talk, I said. I'll come by later. Okay, she replied quietly. I'll be here. I hung up, feeling a mix of dread and relief. I didn't know how the conversation would go, but I knew it had to happen. It was time to stop avoiding the inevitable and face the truth, whatever that meant for both of us. When I pulled up to the house later that afternoon, it felt different, almost foreign, like it wasn't mine anymore. It's strange how quickly a place can stop feeling like home when everything inside it feels broken. I sat in the car for a few minutes, gathering my thoughts, rehearsing what I wanted to say. No matter how many times I went over it in my head, the words felt heavy, like they weren't enough to carry the weight of what I needed to tell her. Emily was sitting in the living room when I walked in, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and tired, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. There was so much unsaid between us, so many emotions swirling in the space between us, but neither of us spoke. I finally broke the silence. Thanks for agreeing to talk, I said, keeping my voice steady. She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. I've been waiting for you to call, she admitted. I wasn't sure if you would. I needed time, I said, sitting down across from her. And honestly, I still don't know if I'm ready to have this conversation. But we can't keep avoiding it. She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring nervously. I noticed she hadn't taken it off, and something about that made my chest tighten. Mine was still on, too, but it felt more like a weight than a promise now. I know I've hurt you, she said quietly, her voice trembling. And I know I can't undo what I've done. But I love you, and I want to fix this. I don't know how. I leaned back, letting out a long breath. I don't think this is something you can fix, Emily, I said. You didn't just make a mistake, you made a choice. Over and over again. And I don't know if I can move past that. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't look away this time. I know, she whispered, and I don't blame you for feeling that way. But I'm asking you to at least try. Please. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt the weight of everything we'd built together. The laughter, the memories, the life we'd shared. But those moments felt so far away now, like they belonged to a different version of us. One we couldn't get back to. Emily, I said finally, my voice soft but firm, I've been trying. Ever since I found out, I've been trying to convince myself that we could fix this. that maybe I could forgive you, or that we could somehow go back to the way things were. But the truth is, I can't. I don't trust you anymore, and I don't think I ever will." She flinched, like my words physically hurt her. "I never wanted to lose you," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I messed up, but I never stopped loving you." I shook my head, my throat tight. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. Love isn't just words, Emily. It's actions. And your actions told me everything I needed to know." The tears started falling then, and she didn't try to stop them. "I don't know how to let you go," she said, her voice barely audible. I looked at her, and for a moment, I felt a pang of something. Sympathy, maybe, or sadness. I didn't want to hurt her, but I couldn't ignore the fact that she'd already hurt me far more than I could ever hurt her. This wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about self-preservation. "I think we've already let each other go," I said quietly. "We just didn't want to admit it." She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "So, what happens now?" I took a deep breath. "We figure out the logistics," I said. "The house, the finances, everything. And then we go our separate ways." Her face crumpled, but she didn't argue. Maybe she knew there was nothing left to say. Or maybe she was just too tired to fight. Either way, I felt a strange sense of relief. Not because I wanted this to happen, but because it felt like the right thing to do, for both of us. We spent the next hour talking through the practicalities. I told her I'd find somewhere else to stay while we sorted out the house, and she agreed to handle most of the communication with the realtor. It was a painfully civil conversation, and by the time it was over, I felt like a stranger in my own life. As I stood to leave, she followed me to the door. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," I replied. "I'm sorry, too." She hesitated, like she wanted to say more, but I didn't give her the chance. I walked out before she could, closing the door behind me with a finality that felt heavier than I expected. As I got into my car and drove away, I realized that was probably the last real conversation we'd ever have. And as much as it hurt, there was a strange sense of peace in that. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. And maybe that was enough for now. The days after that conversation felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. I packed a bag and moved into a short-term rental across town. It was small and sparse, just a one-bedroom with mismatched furniture and a view of a parking lot, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I had space to just exist without Emily's shadow looming over me. It wasn't easy, though. The silence that I'd once craved felt deafening now. The absence of her presence, as painful as it had become, still left a void that I didn't know how to fill. I kept myself busy, throwing myself into work and any small task that would keep my mind from wandering too far. I started jogging in the mornings, something I hadn't done in years. It wasn't because I suddenly cared about fitness. It was just a way to outrun my thoughts, at least for a little while. Emily and I communicated sparingly during those weeks, mostly through texts or emails about the house. She'd already contacted a realtor, and the process of selling the place was moving faster than I expected. Every time I saw her name pop up on my phone, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or guilt. But I reminded myself that this was the right choice. Staying would have only prolonged the inevitable. One day, while sorting through some paperwork for the house, I found an old photo of us tucked into a folder. It was from our first anniversary. A picture of us standing on the beach, arms wrapped around each other, laughing at the camera. I stared at it for a long time, trying to reconcile the people in that photo with the ones we'd become. How had we gone from that to this? Was it always going to end this way? Or could we have done something to stop it? I ended up shoving the photo back into the folder, unable to look at it anymore. That night, I tossed and turned in bed, haunted by memories of the life we'd built and the pieces we were now trying to pick up. A week later, the house sold. It happened so fast that it almost felt like a blur. Emily handled most of the logistics, and I signed whatever documents she sent over. When the final paperwork was done, she called me. "It's all set," she said, her voice soft but steady. "The house is officially sold." "Okay," I said, not sure what else to say. There was a long pause before she spoke again. It feels final, doesn't it? She said. It is final, I replied. Another pause. I just wanted to say thank you, she said finally, for not making this harder than it had to be. I know I didn't deserve that kindness, but thank you anyway. I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me wanted to tell her that it wasn't kindness, it was exhaustion. I didn't have the energy to fight anymore. But instead, I just said, "You're welcome." That was the last real conversation we had. After that, we went our separate ways, and the threads that had once tied our lives together began to unravel completely. In the weeks that followed, I started to feel a strange sense of freedom. It wasn't happiness exactly. I wasn't there yet, but it was lighter than the weight I'd been carrying. I no longer had to wonder where Emily was, who she was with, or whether she was telling me the truth. The paranoia and constant questioning were gone, replaced by an emptiness that I slowly began to fill with pieces of myself I'd forgotten about. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, people I drifted away from during my marriage. One of them, a woman named Rachel, had been part of my circle back in college. We grabbed coffee one afternoon, and for the first time in a long time, I found myself laughing. Real, genuine laughter that didn't feel forced or hollow. It was a small moment, but it reminded me that life could still be good, even after everything. I also started therapy. Mark had been pushing me to see someone for weeks, and I finally gave in. At first, I wasn't sure what to expect, but it ended up being one of the best decisions I made. Talking to someone who wasn't emotionally involved helped me untangle the mess in my head. I realized that the cracks in my marriage had been there long before the cheating happened. Emily's betrayal was just the final blow. It wasn't the whole story. The process wasn't easy, but it felt like progress. Little by little, I started to reclaim pieces of myself that I'd lost in the chaos. I stopped replaying every argument, every lie, every moment that made me question whether I was enough. I started looking forward instead of back. One evening, about 2 months after the house sold, I got a message from Emily. It was short, just a few lines saying she hoped I was doing well and that she was sorry for everything. She said she wasn't looking for forgiveness. She just wanted me to know that she was working on herself and wished me the best. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. When I finally did, my reply was simple. I hope you're doing well, too. It wasn't closure, not really. I don't think closure is something you can find in a text message. But it was enough to know that we were both trying to move on, even if our paths would never cross again. By the time I put my phone down, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. I didn't have all the answers, and I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. Maybe that was enough. A few months later, I finally felt like my life was coming back together. It wasn't perfect. I still had bad days, nights when I'd lie awake wondering how everything fell apart. But those moments didn't control me anymore. I had built a new routine, one that was mine and mine alone. I wasn't looking over my shoulder, second-guessing every decision or replaying the past. I was moving forward, step by step. One evening, Mark convinced me to go out for drinks. He'd been trying to get me back into the social scene for months, and I finally gave in. The bar was lively, full of chatter and music that was just loud enough to make conversation a little challenging. Mark introduced me to a few of his coworkers, and for the first time in ages, I found myself enjoying the company of strangers. It felt good to talk about normal things, work, hobbies, weekend plans, without the heavy weight of my past marriage hanging over me. That's when I saw her. Across the room, near the back of the bar, Emily was sitting with a small group of people. She hadn't noticed me yet, but I froze, unsure of how to handle it. It had been months since we'd spoken, and I wasn't expecting to see her, let alone in a place like this. Mark noticed my reaction and followed my gaze. "Is that?" he asked, lowering his drink. "Yeah," I said, my voice tight. "Do you want to leave?" he asked, his tone careful. I shook my head. "No, I'm fine." It wasn't entirely true, but I wasn't about to run. I wasn't the same person I'd been back then, and I didn't want her presence to dictate my life anymore. Still, I kept my distance, staying on the other side of the bar. A part of me hoped she wouldn't notice me, but of course, she eventually did. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment, neither of us moved. She looked surprised, maybe a little uneasy, but she quickly composed herself. She said something to the people she was with and stood, walking toward me. My heart pounded, but I kept my face neutral, refusing to let her see how much this moment was affecting me. "Hey," she said when she reached me, her voice soft. "Hey," I replied, my tone even. There was an awkward pause, the kind where you both know there's too much history between you to pretend everything's fine. She fidgeted with the strap of her purse, glancing down before meeting my eyes again. "You look good," she said, offering a small smile. "Thanks. You too," I replied, keeping it polite but distant. She nodded, her smile faltering slightly. I wanted to say hi. I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Yeah, same," I said, taking a sip of my drink. Another pause. I could tell she was searching for something to say, but I didn't feel like making it easier for her. This wasn't my moment to comfort her. It wasn't my responsibility anymore. "How have you been?" she asked finally. "Good," I said simply. "Busy, but good." She nodded again, her fingers still fidgeting with her purse. "That's good to hear. I'm glad." I didn't ask how she was doing. I didn't need to. Whatever her life looked like now, it wasn't my concern. We stood there for a few more seconds, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. Finally, she broke the silence. "Well, I won't keep you," she said, stepping back slightly. "It was good to see you." "You too," I said, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. She gave me one last small smile before turning and walking back to her table. I watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and closure. It wasn't the dramatic moment I'd imagined it might be, but maybe that was for the best. Life doesn't always give you the clean endings you hope for, but sometimes a quiet moment is enough. I turned back to Mark, who raised an eyebrow at me. "You good?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. For the rest of the night, I didn't think about Emily. I laughed, I talked, I enjoyed myself in a way I hadn't in a long time. And as I walked home later, the cool night air brushing against my face, I realized something. I was finally free. Free from the pain, the doubt, and the constant weight of what-ifs. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough.